The World Bank and IMF have had major impacts on indigenous peoples around the world, particularly in the so-called third world countries. But there are other international forces, such as the World Trade Organization, or WTO, and free trade agreements that are impacting indigenous peoples, whether they're in so-called first world countries or so-called third world countries, all around the world. These free trade agreements and the World Trade Organization itself are having huge impacts on indigenous peoples and their lands. So let's take a look at what's going on with this. The World Trade Organization. Where to start with this one? Okay, so the World Trade Organization was formed under Democratic President Bill Clinton. He's the one that really was very big in ushering this in, but it was definitely a Democrat-Republican supported international venture. It derived, although it was formed in 1995, it derives from that General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or GATT, that I told you about, that was established in 1947 at Bretton Woods. GATT, like I said, was about voluntary free trade agreements. When the World Trade Organization was formed, it increased the power of GATT, essentially, and turned it into enforced free trade agreements. So those countries who sign onto the World Trade Organization, as you'll see, as most of the countries in the world, those countries who have signed on to the World Trade Organization, they are required to make sure that their nation's laws and policies are reflective, are compatible with the policies of the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization makes these trade agreements, and then it's up to the nations who are a part of these trade agreements to make sure that their nation's laws and policies are compatible with World Trade Organization trade agreements, or those nations suffer the penalties. And when those nations have to make sure that their laws and policies are compatible with WTO trade agreements, that means all layers of that nation's political system have to be in conformity with these trade agreements, which includes tribal, state, local municipalities, local townships, counties, all of it. Will any of those rules and regulations that conflict with World Trade agreements are subject to be overturned in subsequent lawsuits and court cases, and in various ways. We'll talk about a bit of how that all works. So this is what we mean by global forces. You can act locally all you want, but if you're not paying attention to global forces that are impacting what can happen at the local level, then you're setting yourself up for some serious consequences there. So there's global forces that need to be being paid attention to here. The World Trade Organization, from its own website, in brief, it says it is the only international organization that deals with the global rules of trade. Its main function, and this is what I want you to pay attention to, is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. So its purpose is to essentially establish binding rules for global commerce between member nations, and all member nations are bound to these or they'll suffer the trade penalties. And all of these binding national agreements that these are binding international agreements that these national governments agree to, in other words, these binding trade agreements, the whole goal of these is to ensure that there are no obstacles to free trade. What are obstacles to free trade? Things like tariffs that protect local farmers, things like environmental regulations that protect wilderness areas or forests, things like indigenous rights and the recognition of treaty rights. It goes on and on. Things like health regulations that say you can't spray DDT on fruit because that gets into the juice or the fruit that you're eating, and that causes cancer in people, and bad things happen, and it damages the environment. Those are all obstacles to free trade that WTO agreements have actually gone after in various ways. So just to take the DDT example, we have banned the use of DDT in the United States, so we feel good, right? But we know we actually still produce it in the United States, and then we sell it to countries that haven't banned it. They spray it on their fruits and vegetables or whatever they're spraying it on, and then we ship those fruits, vegetables, juices back into the United States because, according to WTO agreements, we can't ban their products just because we think they have unhealthy chemicals in the products. We can't do that. So we accept their juices back in. Those juices, if you take a look at any juice, it'll say what countries they come from. They come from a country that uses something like DDT, you're going to be having that in your juice. And WTO says we can't stop that from coming in here right? Because that would violate their free trade agreements, and that would be presenting an obstacle to trade. The European Union has gotten into some trouble with the WTO because it does not want to accept, I haven't looked up the most recent updates on this issue, but the European Union has not wanted to accept genetically engineered beef, GMO beef, right? And so it's gotten into some trouble with the WTO there because that is putting up an obstacle to free trade. So like I said, yeah, free trade agreement, which is essentially removing all obstacles to corporate trade. It is about global trade, and the local economies are made subservient to and oftentimes just completely obliterated by this global corporate trade based on, global corporate trade based on free trade, the elimination of obstacles to global corporate trade. Really interesting thing with the WTO. The first director, according to Victor Menotti from that Paradigm Wars book, and you see Jerry Mander, who was very instrumental in establishing organizations to fight this globalization in order to protect local communities, including indigenous peoples. You'll see this title in some of his works about the World Trade Organization. But according to Victor Menotti, the first Director General of the World Trade Organization refers to the WTO as a global government for the new millennium. And how does that work? What is that coming from? The WTO passes laws for its member countries, right? That's what those free trade agreements essentially are. They come together, they decide what agreements they're going to make, and then those agreements become law, and their member countries their nations have to conform to that. It settles disputes in its own courts, what are called WTO tribunals. So if the European Union says we don't want beef, and the WTO says, well, you have to because you have to accept that GMO beef into your borders, they're going to settle that in a private, secret tribunal that the WTO holds. They have their own courts, and so they settle that dispute outside of the public eye. And they have major enforcement powers. They don't have an army or anything like that, but they have major financial enforcement powers. So if you don't conform to these agreements, if you renege on these agreements, or you put up an obstacle to trade you weren't supposed to because you're trying to protect your people or your land or the workers, what have you, then you can suffer major trade penalties for that. Major trade penalties. And yes, again, of course, all of these agreements and decisions made in the tribunals affect every level of a nation's political structure, tribal, state, local, etc. A global government for the new millennium based on trade. Here is a map of the total members as of 2023. The ones in yellow are the ones who are not yet members, but they are like pending status. The ones in gray just aren't, even interested. So like I said, every single country in the world is just about a part of the World Trade Organization. I want you to pay attention to the fact that while this is a very capitalistic organization, as you can tell by everything it's talking about, socialist countries are very much a part of this also, right? So even their own socialist policies have to conform to the World Trade Organization. All right, one example of the World Trade Organization that I can't pass on it because I'm trying to make this as brief in a nutshell as possible. It's really hard. But there's one that really has impacted indigenous peoples, and this is a World Trade Agreement called TRIPS, or the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights. This trade agreement essentially allows corporations to patent life forms. So far, much of this has been focused on like seeds and plants and that sort of thing, right? So the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS, trade agreement through the WTO, allows the patenting of organisms, doesn't require the corporation to declare the source of the genetic material that they are getting, or the genetic resource, and increasingly companies are scouring the globe for indigenous knowledge, and finding indigenous medicinal knowledge or other knowledge, but particularly medicinal. Pharmaceuticals love indigenous knowledge to mine essentially the indigenous knowledge about plant medicines. Which is a really interesting point. As we have a modern medical system that really despises and makes fun of traditional medicines, at the same time that modern medicine institution that we have today, which is hugely funded by pharmaceutical companies, those same pharmaceutical companies are going to these traditional knowledge holders and trying to mine their information that they have about these traditional medicines so they can take that information, go take the plants that these medicines come from, map their genomes, patent that plant, and then make synthetic versions of those same traditional medicines and then sell them as big pharma, right? So this is what TRIPS all allows, and the people who get this, who this information is mined from, don't even have to be acknowledged, much less do they have to, or is there any requirement that they should receive profits from this? And the patents give the people, the corporations, I should say, exclusive control over this organism. Now, that is so problematic in so many ways. One, from an indigenous viewpoint, how can you claim, you know, it used to be people would say, how can you claim to own land? Now we have people outright claiming to own life forms, right? Because they have a patent on it. So they claim to have exclusive control. And what this means in the economic sense is that anybody who is caught using this patented life form can be held legally responsible and legally liable. This happened with a farmer whose name is Percy Schmeiser in Canada. He was a Canadian farmer who did not like to grow GMO seeds. He was a seed saver. He had been saving seeds from generation upon generation that came from, you know, like his father and so on and so forth. And this is what he grew. But his neighbor grew Monsanto GM seeds, and those seeds mixed with some of his. And so Monsanto went after him and sued him in court for growing Monsanto seeds without having bought them. And he said, no, I don't want them. I don't want your crops. And it was a big thing. And he lost. He lost in the courts, right? So there's a really interesting film that came out recently that has Christopher Walken in. It's called Percy versus Goliath. If you haven't seen it yet, you really should see it. And his case is representative of what's happening with farmers all around the world. If you take a look at India and what's happening with farming there too, there's so much going on with India and farming and fighting these GMO seeds. And indigenous peoples there trying to keep their farming traditions alive. And Percy Schmeiser has gone over even to India and shared his experiences there. So this is what the patenting of life forms happens, what happens with this whole concept here. Two very specific indigenous examples. One, there was a pharmaceutical company who learned that one tribe in Africa, I think it's the San, S-A-N, what many people know of as the Bushmen, that they chewed a certain cactus. The men chewed a certain cactus when they went on long hunting trips so that they suppressed their appetite, with the Hoodia cactus. And so Big Pharma went in there, found out the knowledge about how this Hoodia cactus worked, what caused this diet suppressant, what was an appetite suppressant, found it was the Hoodia cactus, did the whole thing, patented the life form, and now produces a diet pill based off the Hoodia cactus, right? And they consider it their exclusive right. Wild rice has come under great concern in Anishinaabe people. For Anishinaabe people, wild rice is a cultural staple, and there are people who are working at genetically engineering the wild rice, or at least looking up genetically engineering wild rice from the Terminator seed before it was banned. They were hoping to put a Terminator seed into this strain of wild rice they were working on, which was hugely concerning because they were doing it in wild rice territory. And if that ever got out, right, what impact would that have on real wild rice? But people were mapping the genome of a certain strain of wild rice and then getting ready to put a patent on that and say, we own this. And Anishinaabe people were like, hello, what are you talking about? So yeah, this TRIPS is one of the biggest, I shouldn't say it's not there's so many that the World Trade Organization has, so many agreements that have huge impacts on indigenous peoples, but this is just one really specific example. All right. And although I could go into each of these very, I don't want to because they all really kind of combine together. So free trade agreements as a whole. So you have the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund giving out these SAP loans, these sappy loans, these loans with strings attached. You have the World Trade Organization coming up with binding rules for global commerce that the nation states who belong to them, which is almost everybody, must make sure their national policies conform to, and thus all political levels in their country conform to. And then we have, separate from that, free trade agreements that individual countries make with each other. For example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was negotiated under Democratic President Bill Clinton and was renegotiated under Republican President Donald Trump. And when it was renegotiated, it became the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Both NAFTA and the USMCA were agreements between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to allow for the free flow of trade between all three countries, to remove obstacles to that free trade, all very similar to what the WTO does. NAFTA in particular ignored indigenous rights. There was nothing in NAFTA about indigenous rights. The USMCA, from what I understand, has improved a little bit in that regard. Mexico, however, is right now is wanting to ban GMO corn from coming into its borders. This has been an issue since NAFTA passed, and then USMCA has not improved things for this. But Mexico is the seat of the original corn. It's where 9,000 years ago the Maya cultivated corn, and they have hundreds of varieties of corn, and the Maya still cultivate these hundreds of indigenous varieties of corn. And with the incursion of GM corn from the United States, which all came about as a result of these free trade agreements, the Maya are very concerned about the impact on their native corn. If that seed, like what happened with Percy Schmeiser, escapes a Monsanto field and gets into their native fields. And local farmers are having to compete now with GM products that come from multinational corporations in the United States. So the local Mexican farmers are, so many of them are just kind of giving up and having to move into the city to become wage workers, all that sort of thing that we talked about in the other sections of this lecture. And then we have something called the CPTPP, which is it used to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now it's like the Comprehensive Something Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it is almost every nation on the Pacific Ocean that borders the Pacific Ocean, except the United States, because our Congress turned this down because it was so horrible. And they had Bernie Sanders, when he ran, was against it. Hillary Clinton was for it. Donald Trump was against it. And so Hillary Clinton, facing these two contenders, eventually halfway through that 2016 presidential election, she switched. Oh no, I'm against it, even though her husband, Bill Clinton, was the one who really pushed forward these free trade agreements and the WTO. And so, it wasn't a very believable switch. Anyway, these free trade agreements all have in common something called ISDSs, or Investor State Dispute Settlements. It is such a blah, blah, blah. Who's going to remember that in their heads, right? But the idea is these investor state dispute settlements essentially allow corporations to override local control. So let me give you a really specific example, and then I think it's even better than what I'm going to show you in the slides here. In November 2012, there was a situation that developed in Quebec. Quebec had passed a moratorium on fracking in 2012 and extended it indefinitely in 2014. And it was said this: we need to do more study on the impacts of fracking. In November 2012, Lone Pine Resources, which was a company based in Calgary, Alberta, but was registered in the United States, so therefore it was operating in Canada as technically a foreign corporation. It had been exploring for possible fracking in the St. Lawrence Seaway, and when Quebec passed this moratorium against fracking, that essentially stopped its exploration, and of course put a hold on any of its plans to do fracking in the St. Lawrence Seaway. So under these investor state dispute settlements, and this specifically would have been NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that it was able to do this, Lone Pine Resources sued Canada for loss of potential future profits. It sued Canada for loss of potential future profits. And as far as I know, this case is still ongoing in the courts. But this is just one example of what the ISDSs allow a corporation to do. If you pass something on your local level or your provincial level, your state level, your tribal level, that conflicts with a corporation's future profits, and that corporation is technically a foreign corporation, is from Canada or Mexico, under NAFTA, as it used to be called, now USMCA, that corporation had the right to sue, the government who was upholding this local obstacle to their particular trade. The CPTPP is the same thing. Any member nation within that who operates has a corporation operating in another nation that's also party to this agreement, and if that corporation runs into a similar obstacle to its trade, it can then go take its issue to the investor state dispute settlement process and have it heard there, and the corporation can then override these local protections of people who are trying to protect their land. So take a look at these slides here, which might make it clear. So there's a treaty that's made between two countries. Then there's a foreign investor who, so you have the mining company over here, and you have a foreign investor, and this foreign investor is invested in this mining company, but that mining company has its permit revoked because the local residents are concerned about waste discharge. The foreign investor says, but that affects our future profits, the profits we expected to get out of this. So we're going to sue you, government, because you're violating the free trade agreement. So you have the ISDS claim, somebody who's claiming you're impacting our future expected profits. You have the community over here saying it's our land, we do not consent, no mine. And then the state government, the government who has the local people who are trying to protect their land, the one where the mine was proposed for, they're the ones that are being sued. This leads to a situation where arbitrators are set up through this free trade agreement, and the people are excluded because it's just like the WTO operates in the same sort of way. As these free trade agreements, these arbitrators are set up in these private tribunals where the lawyers for the company sue are in a arbitration with lawyers from the host state whom they are suing. The host state being the state where the mine was proposed for, and where the local people are saying, no, we don't want this mine. And you have this one guy over here saying no third parties, and the people are considered third parties, right? They're supposed to be uninterested third parties. But as you can see, the company and the state are the two that are talking to each other through these arbitrators, and the people are excluded from the whole entire process. And where you see over and over again is companies hold sway because their free trade agreements are protecting them and their investments, and there's very little protection for local people, local communities, and local tribes, right? So this is one of the biggest problems with these free trade agreements, is these ISDSs, or what are called investor-state dispute settlements. This is a really confusing thing I'm trying to simplify, so if you don't understand this, please, please, please ask questions, and I'm more than happy to clarify and try to go into this further.